the first rude surprises many new and beginning farmers face are the myriad rules and regulations that govern what they can and cannot do on a specific piece of property. From floodplain rules that govern what, if any, structures are allowed and where they can be located, to regulations covering where you can put a new driveway or even have public events, the number of rules and regulations affecting farmers can seem overwhelming. On top of that, simply determining whether you need to be talking with federal, state, or local county personnel on a particular land use topic can be more than a little confusing. While county rules will differ some depending on jurisdiction, there are strong similarities across the board, no matter where you are in Washington state. During a recent Cultivating Success course, we invited land use personnel from both King and Snohomish counties to share their expertise in order to gain a better understanding of what potential regulations may influence how a new or existing farm can develop infrastructure and expand activities. The speakers include Eric Beach, a regulatory and permitting specialist with King County, and Rebecca Sammy, a principal planner with Snohomish County.
My name is Eric Beach. I'm with the King County Agricultural Program. We aren't part of the Department of Local Services Permitting Division, which is the county government that issues permits. We're part of the Department of Natural Resources and Parks. And my position is relatively new. I'm the first incumbent. I've been there coming up on 5 years. And a lot of my work is doing individual tech support to farmers and small forest landowners that are finding themselves challenged with the land use regulations. So what I want to do this evening is kind of go through why we have land use regulations and what the ones that you might expect to impact your operations would be, and then offer you some guidance on how to deal with those, and some contact information for some people can assist as you continue your operations. We're going to cover the regulations that impact agriculture in King County and talk a little bit about how to get a permit, how to resolve a code enforcement action, and how to get the assistance that you need in order to successfully operate your farm in a highly regulated environment that King County is. We have regulations. I realize this is pretty basic, but it's worth referring to because people ask, well, why do I have to do that? Well, regulations lead to the proper function of economies and societies. If you really want to see, you know, a good applied example of why we have codes is look at the impacts of an earthquake in North America versus the impact of an earthquake in some other region that doesn't have building codes. And you see that there's a lot more fatalities, a lot more property damage. So, you know, regulations are based there to help people operate in an effective and safe manner. There's 3 levels. The federal government sets the overall direction on a number of policies. The state government builds upon that. And then the local governments must comply with those laws. And then they provide a direct service to the citizens, and they also are responsible for the land use planning. In King County, everything is driven by the comprehensive plan. It's going through an update currently. That drives all the land use policies in the county. King County regulations support the comprehensive plan, and it has some major themes. And I want you to see where agriculture fits in these, because this is one of the ongoing challenges with farming in King County in 2021, is the major themes of the land use regulations are creating sustainable neighborhoods, preserving open space and natural resource lands, directing development towards existing communities, and providing a variety of transportation choices. I was saying about today as I was putting this presentation together, it doesn't really emphasize the natural resource industries. It is more about the preservation of the resource lands. And the code is implemented by issuing permits. If you want to do something, you go get a permit. And then if you don't go get a permit, then the county will pay you a visit and help you obtain a permit. So those are the two ways that the regulations are implemented on the ground. So why aren't we focused on natural resources such as farming in King County? Well, it basically comes down to the demographics. There's about 1,800 farms in King County. There's about 10,000 farm workers associated with those farms, and that comes out to about 0.5% of the population. There's about 50,000 acres being farmed, and that's about 3% of the overall land base of King County. Agricultural lands, as you can, in this diagram here, you can see that they're focused in, or they're concentrated in the Snoqualmie Valley, the Enumclaw Plateau, and then that square in the sea of yellow is the Kent Valley, which used to be just full of truck farms that fed Seattle, and then over the course of the latter part of the 20th century, it became developed and is what it is today. The other thing that's interesting as to what drives land use regulations is this graph that shows where the population is. And what we're seeing is a shift away from people living in the unincorporated King County and living in more incorporated areas. And a lot of that's a facet of the fact that more cities are becoming incorporated or expanding their boundaries. So anyhow, that's why we don't have an ag first regulatory environment. Is quite simply agriculture isn't that big a component on the landscape, and it doesn't have that many people engaged in King County. The land use regulations that do impact agriculture are the zoning regulations, the flood hazard regulations, critical areas, the building code, and clearing and grading. And we'll go through these one by one to talk about how they might, how you would encounter these. Would you be farming in King County? King County was pretty forward thinking early on in the Growth Management Act, and even predating it. The agricultural areas in King County were identified, and they were put into what we call agricultural production districts. These once again surround the areas where farming is the predominant land use. It's in the Snoqualmie Valley, the Enumclaw Plateau, the Kent Valley, and then in the Sammamish Valley, which can tell you about the time that this happened. They started this in the late 70s, and it's a very good land use strategy. It's the only green space pretty much in the whole Woodinville-Redmond area is the Sammamish APD, and it does have a number of working farms there. The purpose of the agricultural zone, the A zone, is to protect farmland and encourage agricultural production, and allows some uses related to agricultural production and the building of residences for farmers and agricultural employees. It also limits non-agricultural uses. So within the A zone, which corresponds with the agricultural production district, so there's areas you see up there in yellow and green. The other land uses are limited to those compatible with farming or that require proximity to support agriculture. So they're called agricultural support services. You're allowed to have farm stores, feed stores, tractor repair shops, that type of thing in the A zone. One of the things that I wasn't really aware of that would impact agriculture, and I've become aware since I came to King County, is the flood hazard regulations. And this is a function of geography. If you can look at this map right here, and then we can look at this map right here, we see a lot of overlap, particularly in the Snoqualmie and Kent valleys, because the silt soils are good farmland and they're deposited there by flood. So it makes sense. However, there's other things that are of government concern in floodplains, such as protecting life and property. And so King County has some very stringent flood regulations. They follow the FEMA guidelines, and they're necessary for King County to be part of the National Flood Insurance Program, which is quite important to King County, apparently, because as we talk through this, some of the challenges are because King County wants to maintain a very high National Flood Insurance community rating. and that keeps the rates down. And so as we move forward, if the farmland you're considering operating is in the floodplain, almost anything you do outside of normal horticultural activities will require a permit. Another thing to consider when you're scoping an operation or kind of laying out your farm is the presence of critical areas on your farm. And critical areas are wetlands, streamside areas, wildlife corridors, floodplains, and then unstable slopes. The one that will generally be of impact on your operation are wetlands and the streamside areas, and sometimes aquifer recharge areas. If you have to get a permit on your property for almost any activity, you will have to hire a consultant to come out and do a critical areas report to identify the critical areas on your property. This is an expensive undertaking, and it's just something to be aware of. It's just part of the process. There are some very good wetland consultants that are quite familiar with the agriculture environment, and if you need some referrals, give me a call. I can tell you the ones that do good work in the ag sector. But one of the things about critical areas is the county recognizes that farming is provides open space and is a very low impact activity. So some agricultural activities are allowed in the buffers of critical areas. The building code impacts agriculture. Agricultural buildings do have some reduced structural requirements. In those instances, it's easier to get a permit for an agricultural building. They can be constructed in the buffer of a critical area with a farm plan. And no permit is required for structures up to 400 feet. When this is passed, it's in front of council right now. It should be in code this summer, but right now it's 200 square feet. Snohomish County has 400 square feet. Pierce County has 600 square feet for agricultural permit exempt buildings. So we were able to point to that and say, if this works for our neighbor counties, why can't we do that? So this was a recent revision, kind of a pro-agricultural step in county code. Farm worker housing is an interesting challenge at times because of the overlay of regulations we have. But if you have a farm and you're housing temporary farm workers on that farm, you can get a license from the Washington Department of Health. They have a section on temporary farm workers, and with that license, you're exempt from county code, which is a big deal. And then permanent farm worker housing is allowed to be built where zoning wouldn't otherwise allow residences. For example, most land is A35, which means one residence on 35 acres. But for every 20 acres of farmland that you have, you're allowed to have one farm worker housing residence, which are less than 1,000 square feet. They have some other criteria, but you're allowed to provide housing for your farm workers. And then this last thing falls into the building code, and it's just recently become raised as an issue, is that fences over 6 feet require a permit. Wildlife fencing is recommended to be 8 feet. We're trying to find a way, an exemption to allow farmers to construct wildlife exclusion fencing 8 feet tall without getting a permit. And another issue is, what are fences regulated in the floodplain? I can't find anything in code that says they are. Our river and floodplain management sections feel that it's something that should be regulated. So that's kind of a gray area in King County right now. We're trying to get some answers to that. But the clearing and grading code, it's right up front and saying most horticultural activities don't require a permit. And that's disking, harrowing, raising crops, and raising livestock. Drainage is important in farms in this area, and the maintenance of the agricultural waterways is very difficult given the presence of 2 listed salmonids, the Puget Sound steelhead and Puget Sound chinook. So in order to allow farmers to work to provide the maintenance on their drainage systems, the county provides what's called the Agricultural Drainage Assistance Program, or ADAP. And that's an exemption from King County Code. You work with one of our stormwater engineers, You get a hydraulic permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and you can maintain your drainage ditches. Bobby Lindemiller was one of the first landowners to participate in ADAP. So if you want some feedback on how well that program works, you can ask Bobby. And then we also recognize farm plans. These are NRCS action. The farm plans are drafted by King Conservation District, and there are several permit exemptions if you obtain a farm plan. And it allows you to construct a farm field access drive without a permit, to clear over 7,000 square feet a year without a permit, and remove invasive vegetation such as reed canary grass without a permit over 7,000 feet. As I mentioned earlier, these regulations are implemented by either issuing a permit or by code enforcement. And this is where it gets challenging, because the code is set up for regulating development. It's not well suited for actively managed resource lands. So it's not always clear which farm activities require permits. The code certainly isn't easy to comprehend, and sometimes it's difficult to extract the answer we're looking for. And so permitting is put together some bulletins, which are supposed to help the situation, but they can be equally as difficult to understand as the code if you don't have any permitting experience. So that's one of the things that I'll talk about later in this presentation, is we're trying to put together a series of plain spoken, simplified guidance. So agricultural operators can get straight answers, simplified answers that answer the questions that they're interested in answering. Code enforcement sounds really scary, and it probably occupies 30% of my time is working with a landowner and the code enforcement officer to understand exactly what resolution looks like. Code enforcement officers don't drive around the rural area and look for violations. Code enforcement is initiated by a complaint, a neighborhood complaint. And this can be done anonymously, and it is, I'm trying to think of I can't think of a circumstance where I have been involved in a code enforcement action that hasn't been initiated by a neighbor complaint. There's only 4 code enforcement officers for King County. And so they're very limited in the amount of cases they can take on. So they triage and focus on the protection of life and health, and also impacts to the environment. The impacts to the environment, it is the one that will have a code enforcement, where you might encounter a code enforcement officer. There are several steps in the process. If you have a parcel that's where there's been a complaint, the first thing that will happen is you'll get a letter in the mail saying, why don't you come in and get a permit? And it also comes with you have to send in an application for a meeting with county staff, and you have to pay for their staff time. So it's about $700. You go in, and then they'll go over what you need to do to get a permit. That's the easiest way to resolve it. There are other steps if that doesn't get to compliance, and they get progressively more expensive. So the best thing to do is, if you encounter, if you get the letter from a code enforcement officer, give me a call, and we can take a look and first evaluate whether or not there's an actual challenge, because the code enforcement officers are really hardworking and dedicated individuals, and but they also, as you saw, agriculture isn't a common activity in King County, so they're not as familiar with the agricultural regulations as they might be. So in many cases, there are some exemptions that you might be in compliance with the code with, so we can resolve it early on just by clearing up a misunderstanding. And as later in the presentation, I'll give you some other actions you can take if you encounter this during your farming. King County Code, on the upside, King County Code does take into consideration the positive effects of farming, and most horticultural activities are permit exempt, allowed in critical area buffers. There's a 50% reduction in fees for agriculture, which and that applies to building permits, clearing and grading permits, anything that's associated with commercial agriculture. You have a reduced buffers around the critical areas of the farm plan, and your access roads, accessory structures, accessory structures may be permit exempt as well. However, there are a lot of things that occur on the farm that will need a permit. And as you saw with the overlap of the farmland and the floodplain, if you're in the floodplain, any building or filling will require a permit. And that goes for any structures over 200 square feet, soon to be 400 square feet, will require a permit. Any work in a critical area will require a permit, and that includes removing beaver dams. Quite frequently, people will get a hydraulic permit from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and then remove a beaver dam, but beaver dams are found in critical areas, and King County feels that they should regulate that as well. This is another thing that the county staff, myself, and some others are working on, getting that that requirement removed, and just have the HPA cover beaver dam management. If you create over 2,000 square feet of impervious surface, and this includes gravel, gravel is considered impervious surface, you'll need a permit. And you know, as you might expect, sometimes heavy use areas are larger than 2,000 square feet. In those cases, they will require a permit. It's not a permit, an exempt activity. And any excavation over 5 vertical feet or removal of 100 cubic yards will require a permit. So what about, how do you get a permit? Well, because of COVID, they had to go to 100% online. And I think it has worked out well enough that the county has given up its lease on the permitting office in Snoqualmie, and they're going to be online moving forward. For a building permit, this is good news if you need a building permit, because everything goes through mybuildingpermit.com. And this is the same website that's used by a number of local governments and municipalities. And it's a very straightforward and intuitive way to apply for a building permit. That's the good news. The other permits that aren't included in mybuildingpermit.com require a little bit more circuitous route, and that involves going on the King County website, looking at the applications, filling out the application materials, and then mailing it into the permit. And it's not straightforward at all. It's a challenge, especially if you don't have any experience in this, in applying for permits. If you encounter this, reach out to King Conservation District, reach out to myself, and we'll be happy to assist you in figuring out what you need to do in order to get the permit you need. Code enforcement, as I mentioned before, is the other way that the code's implemented, and it's initiated by a neighbor complaint. Like I said, first step is you get a letter to schedule a pre-application meeting, and you have to send in the fee for that meeting. And this causes heartburn among many people that are still kind of taken aback that they were out of compliance, and then they're asked to like mail in $700 to have a meeting and talk about it. So emotions do run high when they get that scary letter. That's the best time for them to reach out to myself or Jay Miro, and we can help you figure out, you know, what the problem is, and give you some suggested courses of action to resolve it. If you don't go to the pre-application meeting and obtain the permits, then a notice and order is sent, and that's a formal action. And it's both good and bad. The good part is you can appeal that to the hearing examiner, and the hearing examiner is a very fair and thoughtful individual that will review the case and see if there's a solution that can be identified under county code. And or also at that time, you can enter into a voluntary compliance agreement, which is a negotiated settlement with the permitting division as to what you're going to do to bring your property into compliance with county code. The last step, and this is rarely implemented because things are resolved before then, is if there's still a challenge with getting a parcel into compliance, the county may hire a contractor to correct the issue. This is called abatement. Where, like, for example, if there was illegal dumping, they'll hire someone to come in and pick up all the stuff, haul it off, send you the bill. So that's what abatement is. But I just want to point out that code enforcement it's not a criminal action. It's basically a civil action, and the goal is to get your parcel into compliance. And so my advice is to, if you're ever challenged or ever encounter a code enforcement notice, let's talk and see and work it out earlier rather than later. That's the best way to approach it. So who can you call for assistance? Well, you can call me. You can call Elizabeth Hill. She's the ombuds. She works out of the office of the ombudsman. And she's the one that's responsible for resource lands. And then you can call Jay Merrow, who's a farm planner at KCD. I work quite closely with Elizabeth and Jay, and we're frequently all three of us working on the same issues. But our goal is to make sure you get a fair shake from the county, and that we can help you get into compliance as quickly and as efficiently as possible. One of the things I mentioned, the bulletins, we're coming up, and we being the agricultural program is coming up with an alternative to those. And I've been talking to permitting division, and they're going to let me take this approach to the ag related permitting division bulletins. But it's a very plain spoken, comprehensive guide to agriculture, answers the questions you might have, identifies best management practices and technical support and resources. That's the website, farmkingcounty.org. We have 3 chapters we published last year: farm worker housing, agricultural buildings, and agricultural drainage. My goal is to publish 3 more chapters this year. The next one will be on farm infrastructure.
Sammy, and I am a principal planner here at Snohomish County. I'm also one of the floodplain administrators in the Planning and Development Services Department. You're going to see quite a bit of contrast between King County and Snohomish County, so it's great to have that contrast this year. I really appreciate it. So I'm just going to do a high-level overview. Eric and I will have some overlap in our presentation tonight, but we will just get to it here. So we're just going to go over a brief history of agriculture and farming here in Snohomish County, kind of an intro to permitting here in Snohomish, and some resources that you can utilize. It's really important to reiterate the hierarchy of codes and regulations. It's not just the counties trying to be mean. We have to comply with state level permitting and federal level permitting that trickles down and becomes part of the regulatory environment that you as farmers will face. So by way of an example, federal regulations like the National Pollution Discharge or the National Flood Insurance Program, those are federal regulations that then get trickled down and incorporated into things like stormwater management or floodplain regulations at the state level, and then the counties have to implement local codes to comply with those. An example of a state level regulation would be things like our critical areas or our shoreline regs. All the counties have to adopt a shoreline master program if they have shorelines of statewide significance, and how they're going to address those. Farmers typically run into these as well, because just like in King County, here in Snohomish County, the bulk of our ag lands are down in our river bottom areas where we've got those good silty soils. But Snohomish County, we implement these state and federal rules through local permits, such as building, clearing, grading, or floodplain permits, or wetland or critical area studies. Here in Snohomish County, we do work to maintain and enhance agricultural lands. We do it through a couple of different ways. through reduction. Pretty much we do this through policies that are developed and implemented in the comprehensive plan. And then those policies and goals are then translated and percolated into codes. And that's the regulatory environment, things like zoning, critical areas, shoreline, flood hazard permits. That's how we do that here in Snohomish County. So just a quick overview of history of the farming regulations here in Snohomish County. This slide just kind of shows you the hierarchy, or not the hierarchy, but just kind of where we're going so far. So in the 1990s, the Growth Management Act came into being. Both King County, Snohomish County were subject to the GMA. Pretty much all counties are subject to the GMA. It's just if you're fully planning, which means you have some extra work to do, or not fully planning. Clark County is one of the Southwest counties who is fully planning under the GMA. Cowlitz County, just to the north, does not. So bear that in mind if you're all down in southwest part of the state, because the regulations will be a little bit different. So in the 1990s, with the GMA, Snohomish County first identified and set aside lands of agricultural importance. So they did that through a process of soil type mapping, things along those lines, and said, this is where those areas need to be protected. And then that translated into zoning requirements. So flash forward to 2004. A lot of stuff had happened between 1990 and 2004, some big floods, some decreases in our dairy production. In the county recognized that they needed to do more to help the local agricultural scene. In 2004, Snohomish County formalized the agricultural board, or the ag board as we refer to it. And the county committed to protecting ag lands and facilitating and assisting farmers with permitting. So that's kind of where you have my role and position. Keep in mind, I wear multiple hats at the county, as do many of our planners. And I currently have the designation as being one of the ag planners. I have a partner who does that with me as well, Jennifer Lynn. So you can reach out to either one of us. But in 2004 is really when we saw Snohomish County beef up its regulations and become a little bit more flexible and formalized on agriculture and agricultural protections. We updated and expanded a lot of our codes and definitions. And I jokingly say here in Snohomish County, we live and die by footnotes and definitions. And I'll get to that in just a minute. Jump again to 2012. Basically, the county just said, we're going to revise and clarify some of the agricultural uses that we currently have in code. We did allow for greenhouses and nursery operators to sell certain garden tools. So kind of some of those incidental uses or kind of farm support business or practices were now allowed. And then we did a lot of clarification, and we introduced wedding facilities to come into being on ag lands. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I need to update this slide, but in 2021, we did have some regulatory changes again, and the county updated its regulations related to wedding facilities. Previously, you had to have had a barn if you wanted to use a building or a structure on your property. The structure needed to have been built prior to July 1 of 2001 for you to be able to use that. That has now subsequently changed to a 7 or 8 year rolling period. So if you build a building now and you're going to use it for agricultural storage or things along those lines, you can wait that duration, the 7 or 8 years, and then you'd be able to utilize that building as a wedding facility if you so chose. There's a bunch of other regulations that go with that. Reach out if you have questions, because a lot of the farmers in Snohomish County do host weddings on their properties as a means of supplemental income to keep the farm afloat. And also in 2021, we did an amendment to our accessory dwelling unit codes to be more clear about where ADUs can be located in the rural areas, set up some separation requirements, some minimum lot size requirements, because we have to try and balance not increasing density in our rural areas. That's opposite of what we would like to do so that we can continue to protect farmlands. So as we move forward here in Snohomish County, we do continue to direct growth into the urban areas and not create a sprawl situation out into our ag and resource lands. We do have a transfer of development rights program. I can get you in touch with with the planners who do that work. It's been in place for a while. Not a lot of folks have taken advantage of it. A few have, but it's still kind of a fledgling program, but it's there and it is available as a resource to farmers if they would like to do that. And the county continues to look at and evaluate if we need to do an evaluation of accessory uses or incidental uses for ag lands, but none of that has currently come to fruition for code changes. So that was kind of a lot of history, but now let's talk a little bit about permitting. So just pop quiz, you don't have to answer out loud. Is farming residential or commercial? Well, the answer is both and it's neither. It's a little bit of a mix here in Snohomish County. We are a little bit more, we're not as specialized as King County is, or some of our counties to the north, like Skagit and Whatcom, which both place a heavy emphasis on ag and ag regulations. We're kind of a mishmash of all of those things, still trying to balance out our urban and rural environments. But because it is both and neither, that is why we have an ag planner, myself and my colleague, Jennifer Lenz. We can help you sort it out because a lot of it's going to depend on what it is that you're proposing on your property. So my best advice to you, regardless of what county you're working in, is to be in touch early and often with whomever you're working with at your local planning office, or if it's if more of your regulatory framework is in a surface water division, just get in touch early and often and ask questions before you do on your property so that you don't run into a code enforcement situation. It is much easier to ask those questions up front than it is to have to deal with a code enforcement officer on the back end of things. Two of the most important questions that you can ask when you come in to the Snohomish County Planning Department. We are open on with limited staff. We are all remote work at this point in time, but we are very responsive on the phone and with emails. And we also have a service called Ask Permit Tech that you can put your questions in there. But the two most important questions to ask us or to ask yourself is, what do you want to do? We're going to ask you that. What is it that you want to do on your property? And then where do you want to do it? If you have an idea of those two things, we can better sort you through and help you navigate the regulatory environment of how to make your farm successful, and so you don't get in trouble and wind up at code enforcement. And most of the time we'll go talk to Bobby at the Conservation District because she's a great resource as well. So there's four main permits that you as a farmer or an agricultural purveyor would need to be aware of here in Snohomish County, just like you would in King County. That's our land disturbing activities permit. That's any type of clearing, grading, filling that you would do on your property. Normal agricultural practices are exempt. I did provide Bobby with kind of a Snohomish County Code permit exemptions for these broader categories and highlighted some of those sections. And I'll walk you through that document here in just a moment. A lot of your normal agricultural activities are going to be exempt with a bunch of caveats to that. So please ask us before you do, especially if your property is located in the floodplain, and then nothing is exempt and you need to come in and have a conversation. Building permits, RBP and CBP, that just stands for residential building permit or commercial building permit. Some of the terminology, if you're going to convert maybe one of your barns, because now you're doing farm product processing in there, you're producing goods in there, you're going to have people come in tour it. We'll need to talk to you about how that will work under building permit. Flood hazard permits, these are the big stickler. We have a lot of floodplains here in Snohomish County, and we have one very unique floodplain that I can talk about. It's called density fringe. If you think your property might be in there, we definitely need to have a conversation before you start any type of work. There are no exemptions from a flood hazard permit here in Snohomish County, with a tiny caveat that has to do with some permissions that we've been granted from FEMA. And if if you have property here in Snohomish County and would like to talk about that, and it's in the floodplain, give me a call and we can walk through those. Shoreline permits are the other big permit that you would need to be aware of and that may apply to your property. There are some exemptions for agricultural activities, but not all ag activities are exempt under Snohomish County's shoreline jurisdiction. Some of the other common permits that you may run into or need to obtain, and Eric touched on this as well, is the HPA or the hydraulic permit approval that you'd get from Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. And sometimes, but not often, you may need to get an Army Corps permit if you're doing any work that would trigger review under a Section 10 or a 404. That's a lot of jargonese and a lot of alphabet soup right there. But like I said, ask early and ask often, and be in touch with us before you do your work. And then we can help you determine if these permits would be needed. So now that we've kind of seen a little bit of the regulatory framework, how do you find in Snohomish County where you can put your agricultural uses? That's typically the big question that I get at the front counter, or when people are calling in, they say, hey, I want to maybe start a farm, or I'm looking to purchase property to do, duck egg raising, or to have some dairy goats. Where can I do this in Snohomish County? Any of the land here in Snohomish County that is zoned rural or resource zones, those are two big kind of umbrella categories. And then the zoning that would fit into that, these are just the top 3 examples, would be the R5. That basically stands for it's a residential 5-acre minimum zoning, or the A10, which is the agricultural 10 acres zoning, or the rural transition area 10, which is just another form of agricultural zoning. Agricultural is pretty much permitted everywhere. Even within some of our urban zones, it'll just depend on what type of ag use it is. So those are kind of your big overarching zoning areas. Once you've figured out, you've identified a piece of property, you've kind of figured out the zoning, if it's going to comply, and maybe let you have some agriculture there. And I think I may have my slides out of order. I do. So I'm going to bounce to this next one, then we'll come back. The rural and resource zones that do allow agriculture are highlighted here in yellow for you. If and when you crack the Snohomish County Code and you come into Title 30 and you're looking at our use matrix, anything that has a P listed in it, oops, sorry about that, has a P in it, that means it's a permitted use there. If it's blank, it means that use isn't going to be allowed. If it's got an A or a C, it means you're going to go through a different review process, either an administrative conditional use or a conditional use permit. Not so much the case with ag, because like you can see here in these different zones, it's going to be an allowed use. So I am going to jump back though. Like I said earlier, we live and die by footnotes and definitions here in Snohomish County. Footnotes and definitions help to clarify the code and narrow down what exactly the use is, or what additional level of detail would need to be applied to that proposed use. So as you can see in this example, this is from Snohomish County Code, Title 30, Chapter 3022. It's for the permitted uses or our use matrix. You can see all these different footnotes that these arrows are pointing to, and they're going to get to another level of refinement in what it means to say have farm product processing on your property in a building that's up to 5,000 square feet or over 5,000 square feet. There's going to be some nuances there. Also pay attention to the subheadings, like you can see down here on the bottom left. There's rules and regulations, and we kind of parse out differences based on scale or scope of what's being proposed with some of these agricultural uses. So I just kind of wanted to point those two things out for you. We'll talked about that one. So now that we know what zones ag can be allowed in, how do you find your actual zoning? Snohomish County has a really great resource. It's the PDS map portal. If you are here in Snohomish County, or you've been looking at property here in Snohomish County, you may have stumbled upon Scopy. It's a pretty good mapping tool. I personally like our PDS map portal a little bit better because it has so many layers in it that you can turn on. You can change the transparencies, do a couple different overlays. You can go out to Google Maps and look at your property with the zoning map up. It really is helpful. Some of the key layers that you may want to be aware of and utilize would be the land use and zoning designations. And I can show you guys a quick example of our map portal here in just a moment. Our critical areas and our shoreline management program. The critical areas is probably going to be one of your most beneficial tools or layers on the map portal, because what it'll do is it will turn on all of the flood hazard layers, the stream types. It'll identify streams that have that can support salmonids that will come into play with critical area regulations or requirements, because we do allow some agricultural activities to occur within a critical area, but not all. And again, it's going to depend on the size, scope, and scale of what's going on, which is a big contrast into, as you can see, between Snohomish and King County, just from the regulatory environment. We don't have, I guess, quite as many gives in our codes and our regulatory environment currently. That's not to say that that wouldn't change at some point in time in the future. I'm just going to go through the rest of these slides real quick, and then I'll take you out to the map portal and the resource sheet that I hopefully Bobby is able to get to you guys. So this is just a quick slide of some of the different resources that we have. We do have some agricultural bulletins. They are pretty out of date. I don't believe there is a work program to update those anytime soon. Like I said, we wear very many hats here, but we are trying to do those. We also have agricultural permit exemptions, and that'll be the handout that we have. We also have the Agricultural Advisory Board, or the Ag Board. I would encourage you all to get to know who's on that board and talk to them. They represent different positions, from like commodity to equine to youth in agriculture. There's a number of positions represented, and they are a pretty active board, and they can make recommendations to the executive's office on agricultural related matters. Also, you have planning and development services. We are a really good resource. There's a pretty good sized staff, and we're all very knowledgeable about the zoning requirements and regulations. So if you get any one of us, we'll be able to go through and answer your basic questions. If you've got more detailed or specific questions that you would need answered from the ag perspective, they'll put you in touch with me or Jennifer. Typically, it's because it's going to be a flood hazard question, and we're happy to work through those with you. And the PDS map portal is very, very helpful as well. Like I said, we do have our ag bulletins. They just kind of go over some of the basics. They're still very helpful, even though they may be just a bit out of date. We also, and the Ag Board does meet on the second Tuesday of each month. We also lead heavily on Snohomish County, or Snohomish Conservation District. We have a really good working partnership with Bobby and her team as far as working through questions of just, do I need a permit? How would this work for a farm plan? Or just pointing people back and forth between the two of us, because it is a joint effort. And also, like I said, PDS staff, we're a good resource for you as well. A few of the most commonly asked questions that we get here in Snohomish County, and Eric touched on this as well, and there, like I said, there is a little bit of overlap. What's exempt? Some development is, not everything is, and I just want to reiterate, and I'm a broken record when it comes to this, there are no exemptions in the flood hazard area or the floodplains. You've got to come in and talk to us before you do any type of work down there, just to make sure you're not getting yourself in trouble, because it takes twice as long to get out of a code enforcement action than it does to just come in and talk to us. Is ditch cleaning? What about ditch cleaning and maintenance? There are some exemptions for this to occur, provided that you're not expanding width or depth, but you'd want to come in and check with us beforehand to see if you need a permit. If you're doing regular maintenance, that means like maybe every year, every 2 years, that's typically going to be exempt. But if you live behind the levee in the diking district or things along those lines, or you haven't cleaned your ditches in 30 years, hopefully they're not all silted in, at that point, we're not going to look at that as maintenance. We'll need to have a conversation about what permits you need to obtain. In addition, you sometimes do need permits from WDFW to do some of the ditch cleaning and maintenance, but that's typically applicable to some of the larger flood control districts or diking districts here in Snohomish County. Agritourism. Snohomish County is very big on agritourism. We host a large kind of festival of the pumpkins. It's one of the bigger pumpkin patches, one of the big draws up here in Snohomish County. And we get asked the question, to have people on my farm to host these events, does it need a permit? And the answer is yes, you do need permits to do these type of events on your property, and they're run through what's called a special use permit, or a special event permit. And that's just to make sure that if you have big, large tents that are up on your property, that they're going to be safe, anchored, and secure, so that if the public is coming on site, that nobody's going to get injured with regard to those. It also just notifies the county and the different groups that may need to respond that something is happening and that we are aware of it. We also like to take a look and say, do you have appropriate sanitation or potable water, things like that on the property before you start doing some of the agritourism. If it's just temporary, if it's going to be something that's permanent and year round, you definitely got to come in and talk to us, because there's going to be more formal permits that would be required. Farm stands, do they require permits? Well, yes and no, and it all depends on your zoning and the size of the stand. So just kind of putting some of these out here, it's really nuanced, and it's really where you're located, because like you saw, we have a lot of zoning districts that do allow agriculture. But again, we try to keep in with scope and scale within those districts for the agricultural uses that are allowed. Farm access roads, do they need permits? And that's going to come down to a question of, is this a new farm access road, or is this maintenance of an existing one? If it's a new road, then yes, you're definitely going to need an access permit at a minimum if you're coming off of a public road. Again, if you're creating a new one, depending on how you're doing that, you may also need a grading permit and or a flood hazard permit to make that happen if you're in the flood area. If it's just maintenance, it'll depend. Again, it's that, how have you been maintaining it and how are you proposing to maintain it? Are you going to dump a ton of rock on it? We may need to talk about limits on impervious surface, and if you're going to need a land disturbing activities permit to place that new fill. Fences, do they require permits or not? Fences are regulated regardless of your zoning. And here in Snohomish County, we do say that fences are considered development in the special flood hazard area. Again, we kind of have a little special dispensation from FEMA through a lot of conversation for certain types of fences that we would allow with a permit in the special flood hazard area. That doesn't always work or is complementary to the need of the farmer, but it is something that we do offer. And what I'm referring to is basically T-posts and 3-strand barb with an electrified top wire. That doesn't always work if you're trying to keep animals in or out, because I've seen quite a few cows that can just lean over a 3-stand on a T-post and they just are like, that was nothing. Thanks for letting me scratch my back. But the reason we do it that way is because typically a T-post can come out under 20 pounds of pressure. So that's usually the percentage of flood water that's coming through, and they can kind of lean down and then maybe come back up. But we can talk about that more if you are proposing fences on your property here in Snohomish County. But like I said, when in doubt, just give us a shout. We're more than happy to talk to you about any of your proposals. It's actually some of the better phone calls that we get. It's more fun to talk to new farmers in our community and our existing farmers and just kind of what they have planned for their properties. It's really interesting to see what they're doing. But with that, that's the end of my formal slideshow presentation. I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I just wanted to take you over to the map portal, this map portal. So I just wanted to take you on a high level view real quick. If you just do a Google search PDS map portal, it'll take you right there. You have to click through like an agreement screen. But I just wanted to show you mostly how to find the layers that you're looking for. So down here at the bottom, it'll say layers. And then up here at the top, it's jam-packed with information. So it's a little tricky to navigate sometimes. These are the different headers that I was referring to. Here's your land use and zoning designations. You can turn that on. And this map is going to get real colorful here in just a moment. And it'll tell you all the different zoning layers. If we look down here, you can see the A10 zone and the R5 tend to be these darker and lighter greens here. Forestry as well. And I'm just looking for my R5. Yeah, it's the lighter greens. So you can see we have quite a bit of land that is available for, or that does allow agriculture within those zones. Just kind of wanted to give you an idea of the unincorporated areas. Anything that's not in this gray, this is going to be our zoning here. One of the other critical area layers, or the other important layer to take a look at, is this critical areas. And this has a ton of information in here. I find this layer to be the most useful in any of my conversations when working with the agricultural community. And primarily that has to do with this FEMA flood hazard layer. Snohomish County does participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, which means we qualify for a lot of emergency assistance if we needed disaster assistance. It also means that if you are in a special flood hazard area, and because we do participate in the community rating system, there's discounts available on insurance. So I'm going to zoom in. I don't know if I want to do density fringe. Let's go up to the Snohomish Valley. That's a little more fun. We can go take a look out here, just so you can kind of see some of this symbology here. It'll show you if you're in the flood hazard area, or if you're in a floodway. The floodway is the red cross hatching. The floodplain that we regulate is highlighted in blue. And that also will coincide with our shoreline layers as well. If you want to see all of these layers together at the same time in the same map, you'd want to use this all available layers, and it's going to pull all of those subheadings in, and you can turn on the different layers that you'd like to see. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to show you a little bit on the map portal. There's a lot of good information. If you're trying to figure out, you know, property information or what its zoning is, if you click on a parcel, we'll do one out here outside of the floodplain. Maybe this one. So this is just random parcel that I clicked on. It does give you some basic information. Parcel number is a wonderful thing to have if you're calling the office or an address. That's how we do all of our searches. It has a property report that you can click on, and it'll give you basically a summary sheet of all of the different information that you can find in these layers. Tells you which jurisdiction you're in. That's really helpful if you're getting closer to the King County border. Gives you just a quick snapshot of what your zoning is. And then you can link out to some different resources there. So I'll stop sharing. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Touch on that property report, just how invaluable that is. And I've had probably 4 people call my office this week wondering about properties that they were looking at to purchase. And the first thing that I do is pull up a property report, because it's gonna tag out whether or not there's critical areas, whether or not there's an aquifer recharge area, whether or sensitive areas, if it's got wetlands. It's got some really useful stuff that, as you're reading through it, is like, oops, that might trigger a permit if I'm trying to do something because there's a critical area on there or there's a wetland there. And at least they can kind of take into consideration like building placement or design or fencing and that kind of thing. It's really valuable.
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. I appreciate that plug for one of our resources. We really try to put as much information out and available on the internet as we can through these different resources, just so that one, you can become a good partner and advocate for yourself and for your property. And so that you can get a good understanding of what our regulatory framework looks like here in Snohomish County. And once you've had a chance to kind of play with that, because this is the same resource that I use when I do my reviews. So you're looking at the exact same information that I look at. So there's no, you know, kind of what are they doing behind the scenes? What you see is what I see, and it's what I use to regulate by. Same thing with the code. Everything's online. I'm looking at the exact same code that's online. and applying that as well. I did have one other item to share with you. Okay, hopefully you're seeing a PDF. And this is the document that I was referring to that I'm hoping Bobby will get out to you all. I've said that like 3 times. I know she'll get it out to you. I just updated this document this week. These aren't in any particular order of importance. It's just how they came out of code. What I wanted to walk you through, this is our shoreline permit exemptions. I forgot to leave the code citation in there, but I've got the code citations for pretty much all of these other code sections that we talked about that are areas of the code that you'd want to pay attention to. Anything that you'd see in this document that is highlighted in yellow, that's going to be an applicable ag exemption for you. Additionally, just putting it right back out here, being that broken record again, there are no exemptions from permitting in the special flood hazard area. Give us a call, send me an email before you do anything out there. So just by way of example, once you get your hands on this document, just to walk through, it's got the headers. This is literal code section, just copied and pasted out of the online code, just hopefully in a quick reference format for you. And just highlighting these. I didn't take out any of the other exemptions because sometimes it's just good to know what else may be exempt.
As you have heard, there are plenty of things to consider as you either look for property to farm or consider how to maximize the potential of the land you currently have. You've also learned that the sooner you reach out and ask questions, the more likely you'll be successful building the farm of your dreams. We want to thank our presenters for sharing their insights on land use and the regulations governing farming activities. We hope you find them of value as you build your own small farm. Thank you for listening.